thank you for your patience. Pleasure to speak with everybody this afternoon.
And thank you for your patience.
I have a PowerPoint to share, but before sharing the PowerPoint, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and Lindsay Rader. My name is Emily Messler. I'm with MuniCab. MuniCab is a municipal advisor. We're actually hired by the city to assist with all matters related to tax increment financing, special taxes, and such, which is what we're here to discuss today. MuniCab works all over the country. We assist in over 30 states across the country and help with over 500 plus projects. And so we're very excited to be here today talking and advising the city on these matters as well. Lindsay, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Certainly. Lindsay Rader from Plunk & Bolton in Baltimore, Maryland. I have served as bond counsel to the city for approximately 20 years, both for general obligation bonds that the city has sold by public sale at competitive bid or by a direct purchase transaction to a bank, some tax increment financing and special taxing district transactions that the city was previously involved in, and for some Maryland Water Quality Financing Administration loans, which the administration is now known as the Maryland Water Infrastructure Financing Administration. So happy to be before you again.
Great, and with that, I will go ahead, I'm going to share my PowerPoint and go ahead and get started. And if you could just let me know once you see that on the screen.
You see it?
Excellent. Very good. Well, we're going to today during our presentation just provide a little additional background on tax increment financing, how they work, some important considerations for tax increment and special tax financing as background, which we think is important to this discussion today, as well as pros and cons. We will also go over special tax financing, which is commonly paired with and utilized with tax increment financing, and then discuss some samples around Maryland in particular and commonly used tips and around Maryland just as a reference point. But the whole reason we're here today is to talk about, introduce the concept of tip policies. And so we're going to end our presentation with talking about the draft tip policy, what those are, and considerations for the city to consider. So starting with how tips work, just a general tip 101 background, tax increment financing, or short for tip, is the incremental future revenues created from a new development. And this little image over here on the right, you can see my cursor going around the screen. It shows the orange down at the bottom. This is referred to as the base taxes. With a tip, a base is set. And once that base value is set, those taxes continue to flow back to the city from a set district. And once those revenues grow, that new growth is called the increment. And that's all the blue, incremental growth. And it's that incremental growth that is pledged or redirected in some form to be utilized to pay for qualified improvements that are allowable under the TIF and Special Taxing District Act. And so we talk about just the future growth in tax revenues with TIF. These are not new tax revenues, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's due to the higher assessed values likely due to new development or increases in value due to economic growth in that particular district. Tax increment revenues are not always real property tax revenues. Sometimes in many jurisdictions, tax increment revenues can be from personal property taxes, sales taxes, meals taxes, or hotel taxes. But in the case of many of the real property or the TIFs and special taxes that we're referring to for the city, we're just specifically speaking to real property tax increment revenues here. So when using TIF, the jurisdiction is essentially committing to use that future incremental growth portion only to pay for that infrastructure or those improvements to support and encourage desired development. This is not in or across the entire city, but in a specific district. And so this is not going to have any effect on properties outside of what is defined as a tax financing district. When a district is created, you identify the boundaries, that's through a parcel listing of districts, and then that is forever known as your specific TIF district, and then the growth in that district is monitored over time. This is just another graphical representation that we prepared, the red being the base, and those tax revenues would continue to flow to the jurisdiction, in this case the city. So once that base is set, you would continue to receive those. And then the blue is that takeoff of the future growth and the new tax revenues that would be eligible to pay for new infrastructure improvements that are eligible under the TIF and Special Taxing District Acts. Most often, those are applied to repay bonds, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. So here's some considerations to think about. Tax increment financing, as I mentioned, they're real property tax increment revenues, and they're attributable to that increase in assessed values. This is money that normally flows to the general fund, so it is a diversion of property that would otherwise flow to the general fund. Now keep in mind that you're going to continue to receive the revenues that are already flowing to the city. It's that future revenue growth. But a couple thoughts here. There's no additional taxes with tax increment financing that we would be levying. This is the already existing taxes, the existing city tax rate, but it's that future growth. So that's one point I want to be clear on. It's not an additional tax rate or an additional tax levy when you're just talking about tax increment financing. Now, the second point here is special tax district financing. Special tax district financing can be used together with TIF in one of two ways. Number one, it can be used standalone as an additional levy over and above applicable taxes, or as a common practice, it can be used to back up tax increment financing. And in the case of a backup special tax, when it's used as a hybrid with TIF, then it is purely just a backup minimum tax if the tax increment revenues are not there. So to the extent those tax increment revenues, that future growth of a back slide, let's just say that these blue lines didn't come to fruition quite the way that we had anticipated, then what would happen is the special tax would kick in, and that property owner, only that property owner in that district, would pay the blue, up to the blue lines necessary to pay debt service as a backup special tax. But it would not, but that's only when you're using them together. So just to summarize, special taxing districts can be used one of two ways. One is a pure special taxing district where it's an additional levy over and above your applicable taxes, or two, with a hybrid with TIF. And when it's a hybrid with TIF, it is used as a backup special tax to backstop tax increment financing. In Maryland, most jurisdictions elect to have tax increment financing backed by a special tax for a multitude of reasons, but primarily because it creates an additional security on bonds that bondholders like, and it makes the bond stronger. And it also means that jurisdictions like the city don't have to back these bonds. There's non-recourse bonds that can be issued, and the city does not have to put up their general obligation or back them in any way or be obligated to repay these bonds, because the bondholders will rely on that special tax, which is extremely meaningful to a city. When you do have a TIF, I mentioned earlier that the real property tax increment revenues, that incremental revenue is a diversion from the general fund. It's important to remember that that means that the issuer or the jurisdiction needs to also consider that if those revenues are going away from the general fund, that there's still sufficient funds left over for them to cover their additional cost of services from the new development. That's school, police, fire, other general fund expenses that those revenues would otherwise go to pay for. So when evaluating a TIF, oftentimes a fiscal impact analysis is prepared to ensure that the jurisdiction still has enough other revenues left over to pay for its additional expenses in the future. TIF and special tax bond proceeds are not loans to the developer. They are contributing and pledging these revenues to pay bonds, but they run with and are levied on the land. So if that property owner fails to pay the real property taxes and fails to pay the special taxes, then that becomes a lien foreclosure on the property, the same way their real property taxes can be foreclosed upon and that property taken, so that that becomes a form of security for the bondholders. And so that is not an actual loan where it's unlike a typical loan where we're paying it back, and then if they abandon it, the recourse is the building. It is in the land and has a first priority lien right. And that is extremely important. It does not, and this is a financing important point, but it does not accelerate any other debt that developers or banks have, which makes it a very important and helpful tool for financing large infrastructure for large projects when you have mixed use or many developers or many parcel owners, and which is why TIF and special tax are commonly utilized to repay millions of dollars in bonds. You have issuance of hybrid TIF special tax bonds. We talked a little bit about this, but you also have a statute requirement about the term of those bonds. Lindsay, do you want to address the statutory requirements on terms?
Certainly. With pure TIF bonds, the bonds can mature not later than 40 years after the date of issuance, but the special taxing district statute provides that the bonds can only mature 30 years after the date of issuance. With the special taxing district statute, we have to have certain legislative approvals can be made by resolution, but with regard to TIF bonds, an ordinance is required to authorize the bonds. And so what we'd like to think about is, or refer to, is when we're doing a hybrid TIF and special taxing district financing, we have to comply with the lowest common denominators of both statutes.
Thank you. So just quickly walking you through a general process for a TIF, we often think about a TIF occurring in 4 phases. First is preparing a plan of finance, and essentially this is where either a jurisdiction or a developer has an idea for a project, and they realize maybe there's a financial gap in that project, but they're not exactly sure if tax increment financing or special tax financing or the hybrid of the two is the best tool to utilize that. So in phase 1, we prepare financial analysis to determine whether or not TIF is the right tool, how much it can support, whether the fiscal impact analysis is still good, and how much in qualified cost we have that's allowable under the statutes. Once we have a plan of finance that works, then we move to phase 2, and that's the governmental approval phase. In phase 2, that plan of finance is taken to the city, and in that phase, we're going to have lots of meetings with staff, respond to questions. We're going to have both an informal and a formal process. The informal process is ensuring that the jurisdiction and all the key stakeholders are comfortable with the plan of finance and the framework that we've built in. We want to make sure that it's delivering on all the key policies and criteria from both sides, both the development project as well as the city. And once that's met, then we move into the formal. The formal process includes having a district approved, having a bond authorization approved, and having special tax methodology approved, which includes a document called a rate and method of apportionment, as well as the special tax report and ordinances and resolutions that create all of the maximum parameters. So that's where a lot of the legal documentation comes into drafting and having that memorialized, ultimately ending up in a city council session and you having your formal vote and public meetings and having that approved. Once that's approved, you move into phase 3, that's the implementation of financing. In phase 3, you have a lot more parties that come into play. You have underwriters and trustees, many more entities such as attorneys that are going to be drafting documents to ultimately go out to the bond market and raise the capital, with the ultimate goal being that the money ends up in the bank to be spent on the qualified improvements that you want to finance. And so you move into phase 4, and phase 4 is when you're spending the money on the improvements and the project is coming up out of the ground and the economic benefits and the investment in your community is being made. There are pros to TIF. This tool is able to help stimulate development in areas that are otherwise difficult. Oftentimes, many projects that merit TIF can't go forward but for this type of financing. And so it's not every project. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit in the TIF policies, is a project that is getting TIF, special tax, or hybrid of the both. And the first question is, does this project merit public assistance? And so you want to understand what is the criteria that makes this project unique, that will help it stimulate development in an area. And then also other pros, this is a method of financing to help deliver desired infrastructure. There was a conversation earlier, I was listening in about a traffic circle. A traffic circle is desired infrastructure improvements that may be needed in a community, and that would be a qualified improvement under TIF and special tax financing, just as an example. Roads, water, sewer are just a few examples of infrastructure that can be financed under the TIF and special tax acts. It does not require that the city issue general obligation bonds backed by its full faith and credit. I mentioned that earlier, that these bonds can be financed and repaid from the TIF and the special tax alone. The bondholders that purchase these bonds are familiar with that type of security. They understand the risk. And so that doesn't put the city in a position to take on development risk, which I think is very important. And, as a municipal advisor, we're often encouraging and strongly advising our municipal entity clients and, to be mindful that you don't want to be in a position of taking on development risk. And so to have this form of financing that allows for future development and that stimulated economic growth, but to know that it's going to be backed by only that future development is really meaningful. If the development occurs as planned, you're going to have those future tax revenues. If not, you have a minimum special tax that's in place that will be there to pay for the debt service. And if it's in excess of what was planned, then those future excess revenues beyond the debt service would flow back to the general fund. And so the jurisdiction would start to realize these surpluses. And once the bonds are paid off, those future revenues that would not otherwise occur but for the TIF or the special tax are now flowing into the general coffers and available for other uses. There are debt service coverage tests, other administrative costs that I'm going to talk about. It's kind of something that needs to be taken into consideration when doing TIF and special taxes. But they're important considerations and all paid for out of the bonds once issued themselves. So, and that's actually an explain. Typically, there are increased costs of services for the development. We talked about the additional operating costs of the jurisdiction. Those can be paid from other taxes or they can be paid from the future taxes. And so diverting those taxes, you want to make sure that there's additional revenues left over. I see some jurisdictions carve back the percentage of revenues pledged to TIF just to make sure that they do have sufficient amount of revenues to pay for their future expenses. So that's something to take into consideration and often contemplated in the TIF policies. Also under consideration is that tax increment projections are not a guarantee of incremental tax revenue. So these aren't like a pilot where once we say the tax revenues will be X, that's what the payment will be. We're projecting these tax revenues, but ultimately future tax revenues are subject to a statutory process and how those properties are assessed and the market value of them over time. So ultimately they're going to be different than our projections. Hopefully close, but they are projections. But to have that backup special tax in place is very important, and to know that the issuer is not obligated to use any of the other funds or to step in and pay that debt service is very important as well to mitigate any risk back to the issuer. 100% of the incremental tax revenues will go and be diverted to a special fund. And so once that agreement is in place, that the city agrees to pledge those revenues, a trustee will be put in place. And there will be a pledge of those revenues, a transfer to a special fund held by the trustee pursuant to the bond documents of an indenture. And if those revenues are insufficient, there are other fail-safes in place. There's the backup special tax, there's debt service reserve fund, and those will all kick in as additional fail-safes. But if those tax revenues are sufficient to cover debt service, they will cover both principal, interest, and administrative costs, as well as go back and replenish any reserves, if need be, on the bonds. And then the last point here, if an issuer plans to issue any bank qualified GO bonds, any TIF or special taxes, if these bonds are outstanding and we're dedicating any of these pledged revenues, we would just need to take that into account, and jurisdictions should think about that. This is just a consideration for future TIF bonds. So here's just a quick list of some known TIF and special tax projects. We actually do work on Idaho Light Farm project. These bonds were issued in 2007, about $9.7 million, and they are backed by special taxes. Arundel Mills in Anne Arundel County, they issued about $30.3 million in bonds, TIF backed by special taxes. Prince George's County has several TIFs. We mentioned Hampton Park because that was a recent transaction. But they also have National Harbor, which is a large TIF. They issued over $200 million on National Harbor alone, but they have a number of TIFs in the county. And then Howard County issued $48 million for the downtown Columbia bonds. And all of these were going to issue public improvements and other allowable qualified improvements, not any private development, so to speak, none of the vertical construction development. And then we have a long list here, just probably can't even read it, but it's more just about the number of TIFs and special taxing districts, going back to 2014 in Maryland that have been issued, just to give you a data point there. So why we're here today to talk about TIF and explain TIF in the background. The city is being asked, or there may be proposals coming forward to the city to evaluate tax increment financing for projects. And as a best practice, many of the jurisdictions that we work in, I mentioned Tab works in over 30 states across the country, our best practice is to have TIF policies in place so that when those requests for tax increment financing come in, or a developer approaches you and requests tax increment financing or special taxing, that there's policies and guidelines in place, and those guidelines help establish criteria that meet the city's policies and perspectives, match your master plans, match your existing fiscal policies. But they're established up front, they meet your criteria, and other jurisdictions create them. And what we have found, we helped create these TIF policies for many other jurisdictions, is there's really about 10 or 11 key criteria. And it's helpful for both the jurisdiction because it allows them to evaluate all applicants consistently, fairly. It also helps the internal staff to have that guideline to follow and say, we want to make sure that we put all these boxes. This is what's important to the city. These are our key criteria. And if we're going to be designating public dollars or dollars that would otherwise be going into our general fund, we want to make sure that we are getting certain things in return. What are those things that we want in return, or what's important to us? How are we going to mitigate our risk? And so by creating these policies up front, you can establish those criteria. But also for the applicant, it creates a guideline for them so that they know before they come, they say, well, if I want to apply for a TIF, I know I have to check these boxes. And so they can evaluate that. It can be out on your website. It can say that you are open to utilizing these tools when they're utilized prudently and consistently, and when it benefits both parties and mitigates the risk to each party. And so they can evaluate before they even come forward with an application, those guidelines, and ensure that they meet them. So we have been asked to assist the city with putting together some preliminary drafts of policies, TIF policies. And in doing that, we have prepared a preliminary draft. We've submitted that to the city council. It is attached to the package. But in addition to that, we submitted to the council before you. You have two samples: the city of Bowie's TIF policy, as well as Howard County, Maryland's TIF policy. They also have a separate application book, which we've helped draft. We've also helped the city of Baltimore draft their policy, so we'd be happy to provide those. I didn't want to inundate you. I felt like I was already inundating you with a lot of information. But the goal is ultimately to give you some information so that you can start to think about what your policies and procedures and best practices and key criteria might be, so that we can assist you in pulling those together and ultimately get your feedback and produce a version that we can bring back to you to have approved. We've started that draft at this point, put something on paper just to give you something to comment and think through and see what it typically looks like. By all means, that is not something that, it still warrants your feedback and your review and the staff and everyone's review. So I don't want anyone to think that that was something we think is right and final. And from there, we'd be more than happy to provide any additional information from other jurisdictions that we work. And then our goal would be to come back and answer any more questions from there. So I'm going to stop and ask Lindsay if she wants to add anything to what I just went through.
Just a couple of things I want to address. One, I just want to highlight that the draft TIF policy that was provided to you is very much a draft, and I anticipate that both Funk and Bolton and UniCap will continue to have some edits to that document, especially as we work on the companion application that developers could submit to the city. So I just, again, wanted to reiterate that is not anywhere necessarily in final form. I also wanted to highlight that the types of infrastructure improvements that can be financed by a TIF or a special taxing district financing are essentially governed by statute. So you may hear about certain types of improvements that are financed in other jurisdictions in Maryland. Prince George's County is a good example. The statutes that govern Prince George's County's TIF and special taxing district authority allows that county to issue TIF and special taxing district bonds for a longer laundry list of types of improvements than applies to most municipalities in Maryland. So it's just always a question at the time the city is pursuing a TIF as to what is allowed to be financed under applicable law at that time. Also, Emily had mentioned that some jurisdictions pledge X% of the incremental tax revenues to support the revenue bonds that jurisdiction issues. For the Tax Increment Financing Act that governs Maryland municipalities, the city currently would not be in a position to say, for example, oh, we're only going to pledge 70% of the incremental tax revenues that are received with regard to a specific district. The statute currently provides that you have to pledge 100% of those incremental tax revenues. But as Emily pointed out, the hope is that if development proceeds as projected or close to projected, the amount of incremental tax revenues that will be generated over the life of the bond issue is going to exceed the amount the city actually needs to cover debt service, to replenish any reserves, and to pay administrative costs relating to the district. And in that case, you can kind of backdoor receiving the additional incremental tax revenues, because the statute does allow incremental tax revenues as long as you meet bond document tests to be released, excess to be released to the city in each fiscal year. That is not the case with special taxing district or special tax revenues. Those have to stay in the special fund created for special taxes while any special taxing district bonds are outstanding. And with that, we're happy to answer any questions. But one more thing. The application, in addition to bringing the TIF policy before the City Council, we are anticipating bringing the form of TIF application before the City Council at a later date for approval.
Questions or comments?
I have a question.
TIF, Jack and probably Tom would probably, haven't we discussed this prior in some years?
There were some discussions regarding a TIF some number of years ago.
And we decided not to participate, and does anybody remember the reason why?
That particular project just did not.
Excuse me?
That particular project just did not go through.
Okay.
So where are we, this is just for a specific area, where are we talking about?
We're really just getting this in front of the council so you get an opportunity to put this tool in your toolbox. And if a developer would come
Gotcha.
before you, you'd be prepared
There's
to.
nothing, there's nothing specific we're
No,
talking
not
about right
currently.
now.
This is a tool that is not used widely. They may disagree with me, but I think it's a special tool that can be used in certain circumstances. And the key to the thing is making sure your criteria is clearly established, so there's no doubt in what direction, whether it's a go or whether it's a no-go.
So would something like this apply to, say, like North Prom Park? I don't know what the status of that is, but.
It would be more like a mall development,
Gotcha.
something in the old, I mean, I'm going back.
Right,
but-
right, right.
But something like that.
I gotcha, okay.
So just for my understanding, so for tonight, for a consensus, for consensus purposes, we're basically just looking at developing questions and answers, a timeline of looking at the draft, and then looking at the final proposal. What exactly would that timeline be, so we could see exactly what we're looking at? Are you looking at a timeline of the council getting back, looking at the current draft in a month, 6 weeks?
I don't have an anticipated timeline at this point. We just wanted to simply get this in front of you so you could get yourselves familiar with it. They'll continue to work on it. Ms. Rader and the other young lady, I'm sorry, I forgot her name, forgive me. They'll continue to work on it, get you a document that you're finally comfortable with, and if at some point you want to adopt a TIF, then you could do that.
It's under my impression that we're waiting for a more formalized draft, and then we're going to have comments based off of that, or are we going?
You have a draft.
Okay.
And they'll continue to work on that. You can provide feedback now, and then the next component will be the application that would go along with the TIF. So you're getting a draft policy, and then the next step will be a draft application. So we'll just continue to work on and refine this process until we get something that you're comfortable with.
Or should we not have a project that we're,
All we're doing is creating the outline for a potential project. So what we're doing is trying to get you comfortable with the TIF and its components versus coming and sitting down with a project and saying, hey, we have this project we want to move forward with, and by the way, get familiar with this TIF now. We're trying to
so you want
put
us to, okay.
like trying to get it to you sooner so you'll be
Okay.
more
I
informed.
understand.
Yes, and I would recommend actually having your TIF policies and your application approved and in place before an application is submitted or before a proposal is before you, so that it is not evaluated without the guidelines. That way you can evaluate it with the same criteria and guidelines that you will in the next application.
The last time the city engaged in TIF, special tax and district financing, was in 2007, and it wasn't as common at that time to have TIF policies or TIF applications that would apply to any potential project in place. But in the past 16 years, it has become more common to have TIF, for a jurisdiction, to have a TIF policy and a TIF application, and that's what we're really before. I know we talked a lot about how TIFs and special taxing districts work, but that was just to give you background. But the main point of today is to say that we recommend that the city get a TIF policy and a TIF application in place, so that when developers and other applicants come to you with a proposed TIF and/or special taxing district. And quite often they'll be coming to you asking you for just a TIF, and the city's response might be, well, we may be willing to consider a TIF, but we want the companion or hybrid special taxing district backup. We're creating essentially a level playing field for analyzing any of these applications that come to you.
Okay, now how much is this process gonna cost the city?
I'm sorry, I can't speak to that issue, I don't know.
Ms. Keith here?
Excuse me, how much would
Yeah.
this cost the city approximately?
So the TIF and when a proposer and applicant provides an application to the city, that applicant will also submit an application fee to recoup any cost of the consultants or the city's cost for evaluating that application.
And the fee is something that is not actually addressed in the current draft of the policy before you, but is something we intend to address in a subsequent draft.
Before,
This-
I'm sorry,
Go ahead,
I'm sorry,
go
Ms.
ahead,
Jackson.
Go ahead.
Before we get to the next draft, I think it's reasonable and prudent to ask for what the anticipated cost would be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to see
Yes,
that included in
yes.
the next draft.
It needs to be, because as you already know, we've been through enough with taxpayers saying we're spending money that we don't have. So I feel as though it is our right to have this benefit. If we're gonna do it, it's gotta benefit everyone, and we don't want to constantly keep taking from our citizens. We want to be able to give them something back. So if this is not feasible and this is pricey, I mean, if it's gonna cost too much where it puts us in a dilemma, we need to know that. We need to know. I asked you for a cost and you couldn't give me a roundabout figure, a ballpark figure. So I'm thinking this is very pricey. Cause you can't give me a ballpark
Are you
figure.
asking about our fees? I'm sorry, I think I misunderstood. your
I
question.
want the proposal, your fee and the application fee. I want a roundabout figure, ballpark figure.
So you want the cost of Lindsay and Unicap's fees for assisting the city in creating these policies and applications?
Yes.
Okay, we can, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think we can provide those to Mr. Cordry to advise you. We'll have to
Okay.
go back and estimate.
Okay.
those.
Well, that's what we need. We need that.
We will do that. And then, to clarify, the idea is that assuming the council adopts the TIF policy and approves an application, that will provide for a fee to be paid upfront by any developer or applicant that submits an application, so that the city can cover some of the staff costs and consultant costs once it receives an application. So there are two different concepts. You're asking for the cost to develop the policy and the application, and then we will be addressing in the draft policy the way the city will charge an applicant a fee.
Council President Jackson, in the example for the city of Bowie, they detailed the application fee for a proposed developer in there. So that's a number that would maybe a developer would pay in the event that they were applying for this TIF. So that's one example.
Yeah, and we have lots of examples if you'd like them. For example, District of Columbia's application has an application fee as well. I could pull several if you'd like to see them.
And I will say with Bowie's policy, it found, I think, that the initial application fee was probably smaller than it might have intended, but it has not engaged in TIF and addition to the application fee, there are usually arrangements put in place so that the developer is obligated to pay the city's consultants, its bond counsel, its financial advisor, outside of, in addition to the application fee, depending on how it's all structured. So that ultimately, as a city moves forward with considering a TIF or a special taxing district financing, the city is not paying those costs out of pocket.
Well, Tom, Mayor, could we get your fee, your buy-in?
Say it again, please.
Could we get your buy-in?
Well, Tom, you want to go or you?
No, go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
I think that what they've said in terms of the answer, what the cost is from them, what's what you're asking. What do they charge? I think the clarification that was just given makes sense. As part of the criteria, you put in that their fee has to be assumed by the developer, for instance. Correct? Am I interpreting that right?
Yes, once an application is submitted, that's correct.
Yeah,
So there's no charge to develop the draft of the policy?
That's where we indicated we have to come back with the estimates for you. That's separate from.
The application?
Correct.
Okay,
Is that clarified?
Yeah.
April, are
Yeah,
you
I'm fine.
okay?
I'm fine. So they'll just have to
Well-
come back and give us that information.
So I think I'm here. So I think I hear, instead of a consensus to move the whole thing forward, we want more information on the
Yes.
cost.
Yes,
Just when the draft is up.
yes,
the
it's on the
draft.
draft and,
Yeah.
yeah,
Updated draft and
and,
figures.
and some figures.
So we're gonna
Roundabout.
so we're gonna table it, it sounds like, correct? Until we get the cost of developing the policies and finish the draft.
sounds good. And if you have any questions on the materials that we provided in the interim, we'd be happy to provide additional supplemental backup or additional samples if needed.
Could we get a copy of the presentation that you just gave as well?
Yes.
I'd like to get a copy of that to read it a little bit more thoroughly.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are at the end of our agenda items. However, as I read earlier, we are only hearing public comments for the items that was on the agenda this evening. And I only have one public comment at this point, and it is not about anything on the agenda. Oh, there's others, okay. Okay. No, it's not on the agenda. No. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Bob Taylor? And the city clerk, yes, could please, yeah, could, you go to the podium, and the city clerk will keep time. You actually have 3 minutes this evening.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to divide that between two topics real quick. First one, the roundabout. I live just a little bit further than Ms. Gregory does from it, but I go through it probably on average 1.5 times a day. By this time tomorrow, I'm sure I'll be through it at least 3 times because I know what my trips are going to be then. It's way too small to handle the number of roads that come into it. That's the problem. And if you'll look at some of those roads, they're not spaced. Look at the Fruitland roundabout. I imagine most of you have been through that by now. 90-degree separation, 4 legs, 2 roads coming together. Here, you've got 6. and some of them come in at a sharp angle. The turn, for example, off of Mount Herman to the right onto Main Street going across Route 50, it's almost like this. Can you imagine school buses or 18-wheelers making that turn? And where the bike lane's going to be? I mean, it's a disaster in the making. Like I say, I go through it frequently. I would rather hit that light occasionally, have to wait, have to stop once, and then go through it, rather than play ping pong in what's going to be a very, very tight circle. So it's just not appropriate unless you want to make it larger, and to do that, you're going to have to condemn property. It's going to cost a lot more. As it is, it's probably going to be well into 7 figures to redesign that and do that work. You ought to get the estimate or some kind of an engineer's estimate of what it's going to cost ultimately before you spend any more money on it. Okay, next point is the TIFs, and I've sent you information on it, so I'll try to be brief on this. You were just given what was considered to be prospecting. Now, I know Ms. Rader. I've worked with her when I was the county council's attorney, very well qualified. I am not knocking their qualifications at all. Municap was involved in the Idlet farm. TIF probably still is. As I've indicated to you on that, I don't have detailed information because I don't have it anymore on my computer. But I was involved in the Idlet farm matter behind the scenes, both before and after the TIF was done. And there were big problems because it didn't yield the revenue to do the debt service. And there can be a problem like that. That said, I just want to say that what you're seeing is prospecting. Nothing wrong with that. But the more important question is, why does the city want to go down this road at all? We've already given tons of money away to the Ross. We're on the verge of doing it for the downtown Salisbury Town Center project. How much more revenue can we give away?
Your time is up.
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
good enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our third speaker tonight is, well, he's introducing himself, it looks like. John Wogamuth, please step forward. You have 3 minutes. Yeah, that's why I'm hurrying.
You left someone.
Yeah, she's not. She's a little tired of this. TIF financing is the topic, and it's basically a finance plan for large public-private projects. It may be a lesser of two evils over Horizon. We ought to get the specifics on it. At least TIF financing has some chance of success. I believe the success will decrease the more the investment the city has to make as far as getting revenue back from the taxes. But on the positive side, it's structured better than Horizon is currently. It's structured that we get the full increase of the property tax revenue without massive tax waivers that we have with the Horizon project. From year one, TIF revenues are going to be the full revenue. We've got a current design for Horizon that we have 0 tax revenues for the first 5 years and only an average of 10% for 10 years. When we look at the capital costs we have to put in to a bond-funded garage, the city cost with the capital and the interest can easily be $20 million. That's using a very conservative interest rate. So at least TIF, it has to, in its requirements, be sufficient in the draft, it says, to pay the city bond costs and also the cost for city services and the interface costs and the impact costs. I mean, any big project is going to have to interface with other infrastructure that surrounds it. We know that the Salisbury Town Center cost could easily be like the figure I said, and we won't get the revenue to pay for it. So maybe this is an alternative, but it has to be evaluated based on getting these requirements. TIF requires financial feasibility to repay the city. I don't see the financial feasibility in what we're doing now with Horizon. Under the current Horizon project, the downtown apartments, there's no such feasibility there. If you look at the numbers, TIF also has the additional tax revenue to cover all city services, such as fire, police, inspections. We don't have that built into the Horizon program. The TIF requirements have to be proved to be financially
Time.
feasible.
Thank you, Mr. Wogemuth. And could you please sign this form? Could you please sign this form? That would be very kind. Thank you. You got to sign your form. Your time is up, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody coming out to do their comments, but we're going to do our city administrator, assistant, I guess deputy administrator.
Thank you.
We'll start with you.
I don't have any comments for this evening.
Mayor Heath?
The only comment I have is, we are in very desperate need. Not only is it us, it's national now for blood. So if you can donate blood, please do so.
Thank you. Deshaun?
Good afternoon. Thank you to those who did speak publicly. We appreciate the input. I want to give a special recognition to my family and friends who attended this evening, both in person and virtually. I think we have some family from Georgia on the line. My mother, grandmother,
Oh, lovely.
my 1.5-year-old nephew, and my sister. So thank you all for attending. And also one of my good friends, the elected official, Mr. Spuddy Cephas, city councilman in Cambridge, was in attendance, but he had to go to another meeting. So thank you all for coming. I had an opportunity to tour the Ann Street Village, so I was very happy that we were able to approve the donation of those supplies. And so they are still in need of donations and supplies. They're going to be doing a paint day here soon, and they're still hiring for a homeless services case coordinator. And if you do want to donate monetarily, please do so at the community foundation website. I was able to do a ride-along with the Salisbury Fire Department and Police Department, and I was very impressed with our officials there. So definitely appreciated that, and it brought some light into what our officials do on a day-to-day basis. Some community events going on this week. The Salisbury JCs, which I'm a proud past member and past president for, they're doing a bowling social for young professionals this Wednesday at Southbound Alley from 6 to 8. There's a job and career fair at the Salisbury Center at Salisbury Mall this Thursday, the 5th from 3 to 6. There's a public town hall brought on by the NAACP going over the history of Salisbury at the Inspire One Arts Gallery from 6 to 8 on Friday. Also, I believe they're bringing back the Delmarva Chicken Festival this Saturday from 1 to 7, yes, at the Purdue Stadium. So I may have to take a trip over there and enjoy some chicken if I have some time. There's also an NAACP candidate forum at the Inspire One Gallery. And last but not least, this Saturday from 5 to 6:30, at the zoo, they're holding a spooktacular for the family. It's going to be sensory friendly, so take the kiddos out and enjoy that there at the Salisbury Zoo. So thank you so much.
My turn? Okay.
Ms. Gregory?
Well, since Deshaun went ahead and announced all the all the events that I had listed, I do want to congratulate. So the Salisbury Stakes just signed their first 2 players. Johnny, I'm hoping I do not butcher this name, Palatar, and David Bernal Clark. Johnny is from Delmar and David is from Berlin. They've got their first 2 players signed, so congratulations to them. I'm really looking forward to watching these guys play, so I'm looking forward to seeing many more announcements of signed players.
Wonderful. Ms. Allen?
No real comments today other than, as I always, I thank everyone for coming out. I believe everyone who had a public comment, aside from John, has left. So thank you again. We really appreciate the feedback. That's about it for me this week. I thoroughly enjoyed having Deshaun on, so welcome to the council. And it seems we've had some really good conversations this week at the council. I think we're really looking to, it sounds like, and I speak for myself, but the general consensus that I'm getting from the council is we're really looking forward to really bringing the community back into the folds of what's happening here. And I hope that's evident to a lot of the residents that's sitting in or listening in. You know, we've heard a lot of your concerns, we've heard a lot of your thoughts, and you know, we are always looking to raising the bar here at the city. So please come out if you ever have any concerns, or you just want to, you know, talk about something that you're excited about the city. Please come out to our meetings. We really look forward to it.
Ms. Jackson?
Well, Deshawn, welcome aboard. Welcome aboard. Now, I tell you, a lot of people think that it's an easy job, but it's not. But it's only as hard as you make it. And we welcome you. I would like to announce that next Monday, October the 9th, the VFW, Wycomico Memorial VFW 10159, as myself as the chair for youth activities and scholarship committee chair, we're sponsoring every Monday and Tuesday tutoring. We will have SU students come in and help the kids. So if there's anyone who has a child who needs tutoring from kindergarten to 12th grade, please bring your children to the VFW Monday, October the 9th, starting October the 9th. It's only Mondays and Tuesdays that we're doing this. This is something new. We're trying to start something new. We're trying to enhance our community and enhance our young people in the education department. And it's from 5 to 7. 2 hours. We're going to deal with the children. I love them and do anything for them. Then scholarship. I have 2 scholarship applications that I would like for our young people to really get engulfed in. There's money in these scholarship programs. Anyone that is going to college or getting ready to graduate, we have Voice of Democracy. The VFW has that Voice of Democracy, and it's what does democracy mean to you, actually. And that's the theme, but it's an audio, 3 to 5 minute audio. So you have to be in the 9th to 12th grade to submit that audio. But I would love for you to do that. I mean, $35,000 is the national. That's the total award that was given for a scholarship, $35,000. That's a lot of money for someone. It helps. Then the next one is Patriots Pen. And that's from grade 6 to 8. It's a 300 to 400 word essay. I could write 300 or 400 words in 5 seconds for real, just writing and typing or whatever. But I'm asking the parents of the children and the children to take heed. It's money, it's you're learning, you get to travel, you get to see different sites. It's remarkable, and it's something that my heart has been touched with, and I want to see our kids from the Eastern Shore, Wycomico County, City of Salisbury, be invested in this program. And if you need an application, parents, for your child, my number is 410-726-8478. Please contact me in reference to this. I put it on Pack 14. I put it in everywhere that I could think to put it. I've put it on Facebook. I've gotten some responses, but not as many as I would love to have, because our children and our parents who are children going to college, you need help. Everybody needs help when it comes to college. So I thank you. Just so glad to have Sean here today. And I know he's glad to be with us women. He broke the mold. It was a 4-women council. Now we got Sean on. So he broke the mold for us. So, but we fine with it. We're fine. Thank you, Sean, for coming aboard.
And as always, donate blood. 1 pint can save up to 3 lives. You just never know when you or your family will need that. And I think the council has already shared pretty much everything I would share. And I would say with that, this work session is adjourned.